Good morning. Good morning, Naomi.
Well, feeding tonight.
I promised to take her out, so we're okay. We're going to bounce around a little bit today, different topics. It'll all come together, hopefully, towards the end. I just want to do a brief follow-up on Noah because I was getting some texts and emails afterwards. Noah built the ark when he was 600 years old, but it took him 120 years to build, at least according to the Midrashim. According to some people who wrote me, Noah knew from the earliest times of his life that he was ultimately going to be charged with this task. I don't know where this came from. I haven't seen it in the Midrash, but that's what somebody, actually two people, told me. We still don't know what Ham did to Noah, and we could talk about what it might have been or why, and I'd like to maybe do that in a few minutes. But more importantly at this moment, we do know that there are three brothers, and they all moved ultimately to different areas of the world as it was known at that point. I want to go back, though. Talk about names. Adam. Why was he named that? Where'd the name come from? Earth. Adamah, right. Chava, where did her name come from? Life. What's it? Kihi haya em kol chai. Right.
The name of the shul around the corner.
Noah, where does his name come from?
Menachem, maybe
some sort of
Matzachem b'nei Hashem,
right.
Bring comfort to the world.
Comfort to the world, right? And allegedly, his wife was sure.
What you just said, does that mean that it was from the office to the board?
Yeah, that's what Marcus
said. That's yeah.
There's
from the beginning.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
His name is prophetic.
Well, that's the issue. Was his name prophetic or not? His wife's name, if you recall from last week, according to the Midrashim, no. Naamah. Pleasant. Now, but she was a descendant of Cain. Does Cain have any kind of source in terms of a name?
Is it from Connect to acquire?
I was thinking that, but I didn't find any source for that.
Right.
I don't know. Remember, he's the rebellious son. He's the one who's difficult. He murdered his brother. I don't know. Is there something there? Kinah, maybe?
Yeah, Kinah.
Okay, and the names of the sons.
But Hevel, that's an interesting one.
You have Hevel, well.
Hevel means just vapor, breath,
right.
Sort of very
not vanity, but yeah.
It means nothingness, really.
Right.
Which is what his life ended up being, didn't it? Because
right.
He was killed, presumably before he had children, and that was the end of it.
Correct. So that could very well be the case. Now, if you look at the progression of these individuals in the Chumash, we go from families with internal conflicts, and then we're going to Noah and his family and the world around them, which gets destroyed. So again, we're talking about the core family. What's the next stage after that in the Chumash?
Dor HaFlaga, the dispersion of Babel, no?
Babel, right.
That's called the Dor HaFlaga.
Right. So before we talk about the Tower of Babel, let's talk a little bit about social psychology. We were talking about individual psychology until now, And all of a sudden, we're going to something more. In the 1930s, there was a psychologist by the name of Kurt Lewin, who was famous for a bunch of social psychology studies, but most famous for a formula that he came up with. At that point in time, there was a great debate, and on some level there still is, about nature versus nurture. Whether or not an individual is shaped more by their genetic background, their nature, or nurturing, the environment that they're raised in. Lewin proposed a formula. He called it behavior equals a function of the person in their environment. And as we know now, it seems to be, at least until tomorrow when somebody finds it any differently, we are a product of both, probably equally. What happens when we put that in context? We are raised not just by our parents, but we're raised by the environment that we're exposed to. What's the environment after the Babel, after the flood?
Emptiness.
Right. Emptiness.
When they're producing crops.
Yes, but what was the first crop that was produced according? Wine. Not necessarily I mean, we saw what happened to Noah. We don't know the specifics, but we saw what happened. And maybe that was because of trauma and he needed to self-medicate or whatever. And maybe he had a son who was just as bad as he was. That when it came to that, we don't know. But the environment was such that initially, at least, it was such that there was a certain degree of emptiness. What happens when there's emptiness in the social environment? Somebody has to step in and take over. That's basically what's called social identity theory. There's got to be a leader who takes over. And once there's a leader that takes over, people start to follow. Who was that person at that point who took over?
Okay.
After the three sons. Nimrod. Okay, what does his name mean? Where does the name come from?
Merit.
Merit.
Rebellion.
Rebellion, exactly. Okay.
By the way, it's a very popular name in Israel today. Why anybody would call their kid Nimrod is beyond me, but it is actually quite common. Huh?
So let's talk about what he's allegedly responsible for. But first, I want to spend a minute reading what it says about him in the Chumash. So many markers here. Makes me look like I'm intelligent. Here we go. Okay.
Where are we?
We are on Perek Yud Pasuk Chet. I'll translate it after I read it. There are two psukim here that are relevant. V'kush yolad et Nimrod, hu heichel liyot gibar ba'aretz, hu haya gibar tzayid lifnei Hashem, al ken ye'omar ki Nimrod gibar tzayid lifnei Hashem. I happen to like this translation better than the Art Scroll. This is Jewish Publication Services translation. The English goes like this. Cush also begot Nimrod, who was the first man of might on earth. He was a mighty hunter by the grace of the Lord, hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter by the grace of the Lord. Now, goes on in English translation. The mainstays of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. What do we know about the land of Shinar? Not much. At least not from that, not yet. But archaeologists have been discovering some things in what Shinar was probably at the time. Ever heard the term ziggurat?
type of pyramid type of thing, isn't it?
Now pass it around. Yes, and this is the base of one that was found in Dur Khorgalzu, which is about 30 kilometers west of Baghdad. Yeah, but this was all discovered in the last 50 years or so. And this is this interestingly is a southeastern stairway of the Elamite king by the name of Untash Napirisha. Napirisha. Now the base is 16 meters, which is approximately 53 feet. And I've estimated, based on the size of the bricks, that just that piece is about 30 feet tall. I'm not exactly sure how much that is in meters, but that's just the base. But if you extend that, based on what the archaeologists are saying, that is, when it was built, was probably as tall as the Briga building, the two big Briga buildings. So, yeah. So, right. So that's an important thing because in terms of that's what's available now. That's what they unearthed.
Whoa. What they putting there?
I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked. We'll get to it. Actually,
It's like the builders of Brigham.
No, it's not.
except mold was an issue there. I'll tell you why. Cigarettes were built from mud brick. Mud brick. Mud brick. You know what mud brick is? It's just mud that's heated. Requires a lot of maintenance. What happens if it's not properly maintained? And it crumbles, and especially if you put more and more weight on it.
How does this tie in with Migdal Bavel in the Torah, where it says that the whole reason they could do this was that they suddenly knew how to make bricks as opposed to using stone, which up until then they'd had to quarry the stone for any buildings. Now they were able to build bricks. That was the whole reason they were able to build that. Presumably that it must have been about that time, right?
Exactly. That's what the archaeologists seem to believe. So that's the problem. There wasn't enough stone in Mesopotamia to build with stone. So they built with these mud bricks. They deteriorate. And the more pressure that's put on them, the more likely they are to collapse. The higher they get, the more pressure they have.
And of course, if you look in Sefer Shemot, what the Bnei Israel had to do when they were in their slavery was to make bricks.
Right.
The same process. And then, of course, they're told, we're not going to give you any raw materials. You have to go and get your own raw materials to make the bricks. So,
interestingly, not only did the geologists find the bricks, the basis of some of these, they actually found construction lists, how they made the bricks. They also found labor records. And it's interesting because there's a midrash that I came across that said when they were building, they weren't concerned if somebody fell and died. They were more concerned if a brick fell and broke. And they found these. Yes, yes. And they found these.
How far away from the thing they were in just their thought process.
And they found these ziggurats and or Kasdim and Nineveh. Okay. Let's see.
did they find any in what we would know as Bavel?
Mesopotamia is what they're calling it. So yes, it's probably overlapping with Babel.
And is there anyone often that sort of pointed the finger, one being the potential Migdal Bavel, or not got that far?
We haven't gotten that far. We do have the names of 4 rulers, roughly that time. We're not sure if they were actually 4 rulers or some were builders. But we do know that there was a king at the time. Well, there was Gilgamesh, they called the king, but there was also this Nispartaryahu, which could have been a Babylonian name for Nimrod. Quite possible. Okay, so Nimrod is portrayed as a mighty but idolatrous king. He was a tyrant. Why did he want to build the towers? This tower or towers? What was his goal? According to the Chumash, what was his goal?
Make a name for himself.
Wanted to make a name for himself, and he wanted to rebel against God. On the top of the tower, and there's some evidence in this in the geological findings, was a mizbeach and idols. So the goal was to create a religion where Nimrod was, I guess, the god or the god ruler or the person who was most in charge of the world. He wanted to centralize human political power under his rule, which basically means he's a narcissist. Now I could, okay, no, well, I could get into a whole issue here about personality disorders, but I have actually done a bit of a study in the past, and I wrote a little bit about it, that most people who rise to the position of significant ruling have a streak of narcissism. Otherwise, why would they subject themselves to it?
Have a notion of it, not only showing out, they want to be remembered as
Right,
it is.
right. Part of narcissism is the desire to create a significant legacy so that the name is remembered forever. I was actually going to say that. Trump Towers is an example. I'm sorry to say that America's fallen into whatever.
Brigatels?
Okay. So there are themes here that go back to, again, social identity. How was Nimrod able to create such power? He was very charismatic, apparently. So much so that the Chumash gives him two psukim. He must have been very powerful.
What do we read into Hu Haya Gibor Said Lifnei Hashem? What does the Lifnei Hashem add here? If it had just said Hu Haya Gibor Said, what's the Lifnei Hashem?
I think
Is that saying that, as I was listening to what you were just saying, it struck me, is the Torah saying that, Lahafdil almost, that second to Hashem, he was the guy. Lifnei Hashem, before Hashem, other than Hashem, he was the Gibor Tzayid. Is that what it's saying?
I think Lifnei means against here.
Oh, it means sort of neged.
Neged Hashem.
Does that mean
That's a very good point. Because narcissists are always bothered by the possibility that someone will upstage them.
does that mean then he recognized that one?
No, but he recognized that other people recognized.
Which is
It was-
part of social identity theory. Well, yeah, so
You
yes.
might not believe in him, but if you believe in him, then he's a threat.
And they always have to have that in front of them to be pushing against.
Yes, they have to have the challenge so that they can rise above it, at least in their own minds. There's an interesting medrash here from Pirkei Rebbe Elazar. Yeah.
They create their own problems.
Because they never have where they're at.
You know, I don't want to get into politics too much, but when it comes to narcissism, the best example at this point is Donald Trump. And he's been called a pathological narcissist, which means he has a narcissistic personality disorder. I would argue that he has that as well as something called an antisocial personality disorder, which means that he doesn't really care about anybody else. I mean, he will hurt other people for his own gains. But the whole idea of having narcissism is that you want to be known, you need to be known. There's very little humility involved in this individual, if any at all. And anybody who presents any kind of a challenge, whether in reality or not, is somebody that you have to try and overcome and defeat. And that's, from my perspective, the story of Nimrod. But before we get into the whole issue of how he was able to bring people together, there's an interesting medrash here from Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer. How it says, how was he able to become a king? They bring down Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Hakatonet shasa kadosh baruch hu la'adam leishto, haita imahem bateva." The clothing that God made for Adam and Chava, Noah had it, and he had it in the ark. He took it with him on the teva. Kishiyatza min hateva, when they left, lachacham ben Noah, Cham took it, v'hotziimo, and he kept it for himself, v'hinchila l'Nimrod, and he gave it to Nimrod. And the minute that Nimrod put it on, ayokal behema chayav of all the animals came and bowed before him. Something powerful about this clothing.
Which makes perfect sense to the midrash that we hear later, that Esav, when he was Esav was a hunter, Gibor Tzayid as well. The medrash there tells us that he, and I never understood this until just now, he had Nimrod's coat.
Yes.
And there's a midrash that says that Esav had Nimrod's coat. Now, obviously, now from what we've heard there, Nimrod's coat was actually not Nimrod's coat at all. It was Adam's coat, right, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu had made. And the midrash that I remember from Esav was that this coat of Esav's was kept by his mother, Rivka. Why? Because he didn't, it was his most prized possession, and he didn't trust his, inverted commas, Goyish wives that he had to look after this properly, and only Rivka had it, and therefore Rivka was able to use this coat with Yaakov and all sorts of, there was all sorts of midrashim going on there, but the midrash clearly speaks about Esav having Nimrod's magic coat, which enabled him to kill these animals very easily. And that fits in with that midrash there. That's obviously where it came from.
Is there a midrash with Yosef in this?
That's, I'd rather not get into that at the moment, because there are all kinds of theories about that, and it's got more to do with gender identity. We'll get to that. Just a teaser.
If the Bible is not only a historical story, what does it mean about us, each of us? Do we need social identity by all means?
Yes, but just give me 1 second, because there's more to this midrash. So all these animals bow before him. V'hayu b'nei Adam sporin, and the people around him think, shehu, that this power that he has, that Nimrod has, of these animals bowing before him, b'koach gvura, is because of his strength. The fichach, therefore, him lichu aleim the melech. That's why they made him the king. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about social identity. Social identity theory became a big issue immediately following World War II. Why? Because everybody followed Hitler, and all these psychologists are trying to figure out how that happened. So there are a series of experiments that went on, and they're still going on. Without getting into all the technical details of it, you could put someone in a group. I mentioned this on Shavuos night. You could put someone in a group with some compatriots of the experimenter, and have them tell the experimenter that certain objects appear different than they actually appear, and you put the subject of the experiment in with these 6 or 7 others, and they will 70 to 80% of the time go along with this nonsense. Yeah, and you ask them.
It was a line, wasn't it?
Yes, the length of a line.
Yeah, they had a line which was clearly shorter than the second line.
There were 3 lines.
Yeah.
2 were the same size, 1 was clearly shorter, and all of the compatriots would say they're all 3 the same size. That's just one experiment. Then we
whether you put it this way.
there's that experiment, then there's experiment with the
There was a brilliant film called The Way.
right. Yes,
And some the school teacher picture we
right.
to bury it away.
Yes. A lot of this is very interesting. A lot of experiments. There was the experiment of training some people to be jailers and how they would treat people in jail. Yeah, and they would go along and they would actually get worse. So we're all.
Only the nice people.
I don't know how many were nice people actually.
No, but they were okay people. They weren't bullied staff.
No, they were not that correct. They were all. I think when you dig down into the real literature about it, and you find out that they did some assessments of these individuals' personality before they put them in this experimental situation, they were generally basically nice people. Put them in the situation, and they suddenly become whatever they're told to become.
Would that be like the capos?
Yes, could be like the capos in the camp. Yes, not to excuse it, but
No.
yes, yes. There is something that goes along with this. It's relatively new. It's called pluralistic ignorance, which means, a fancy term, but it basically means that even if you don't believe this whole negative leadership, but the group is going along with it, you believe that you have to go along with it. So yes, we're all kind of born with this need for some sort of group. We're born with it. Just like I believe we're born with a belief system. Even people who say they're agnostic, that's their belief. Everybody's born with some sort of a belief system. How it develops may be a product of the environment. Again, nature, nurture, but it's a side issue. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the Tower of Babel. The core theme psychologically is basically, let's call it collective hubris. There's an overconfidence, there's an ambition to defy the limits, to build these towers that just couldn't be supported by the bricks. They wanted to make a name for themselves, at least Nimrod did. All this did was amplify risk-taking, which is one of the side effects of belonging to a group that becomes too powerful. Risk-taking. Jeff? People feel overconfident and
An example of a person, a great cardiac surgeon, who became so overconfident in himself that he could cure the incurable. When you take on harder and harder patients, they're quite impossible because he's a great Dr. Glover. In real life.
yeah,
There's a balance. There's a very
that's a different issue, but it's interesting.
there's a very delicate balance here, because without any risk taking, there is no progress. If you never take a risk, you'll never progress. You have to. I mean, this is well recognized in all sorts of fields. That if you don't take a risk, then you'll be static. And the same goes in, if you like. I mean, and I've spoken about this a few times in halakha, and in the way that we as modern Jews develop the halakha. Unless you take that risk, and this is of course the problem with the Haredi world in that respect, is they're not willing to take any risks at all, and therefore there is no progress. But progress comes with risk, and risk enables progress. It's a symbiotic relationship.
But there's a difference between calculated risk and taking risk to an extreme.
Agreed.
Now, a cardiac surgeon can say, I want to try this new procedure, but if it doesn't work, first time, second time, third time, then maybe he or she needs to take a step back.
Yeah, but if we had no attempt at that, we wouldn't. Christian Barnard would never have done the
No,
first
no, no, but
half,
I'm,
and
yeah, you know,
That's
but,
the point, there are risk takers, and it's healthcare taking, for example. But we had a sidebar. You set up, if you're Christian Barnard, you set up certain things at the bail center, so to speak. That if XYZ happens, I have to ask, not the answer, for ways of minimizing that risk. But you manage it, you take it, but you also have a plan to the not. But I think what I think is that somebody who goes off the charts and
yeah,
like,
I mean, I think
I don't need any.
what Michael is saying, I think, is that risk needs to be managed, and there's a difference between calculated risk and reckless risk.
Yeah.
But that's subjective, isn't it? And I suppose if you're a narcissist, your subjective assessment of that risk is not, you know, we know there are people who are risk takers, and there are people who are very risk averse, and a person can change in his own lifetime.
look, if you're a professional, you're going to take a risk every day, but it's a calculated risk. That's the difference between a calculated risk and making a name for yourself at all costs. Okay, so I want to just, for the sake of time, read the English about what the Chumash says regarding the building of this tower. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words, and as they migrated, they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard." So this is the beginning of mud bricks. Brick serves them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. Again, they didn't have stone to quarry where they were. And they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves." Now, who's really saying this? Nimrod, right? But because he had this following, maybe because of this quote that he got from Adam, everybody spoke in unison as one for him. Then it comes, El Shalbigan. Then the Lord came down to look at the city and tower the man had built. The Lord said, "If as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there so that they shall not understand one another's speech." And they were scattered. That's why this area is called Babel, Vulbal. That's messed up their language.
Need to say that the leader states followers. If we pull Chilo, the leader, it seems that the followers will disappear in the same time.
Which is interesting. The next, yes, leader needs followers, but if you're saying if the leadership is not able to maintain the followers because everybody separates, they lose their sense of leadership. That's true, but what happens next with Nimrod? We'll talk about maybe next time, but what happens next with Nimrod is there's a rebellious character by the name of Avram. And Nimrod tries to burn him to death. So there is a constant
challenge to his leadership.
There's a constant challenge, constant push and pull in terms of his leadership.
What Ishai just said then before, as I understand it, was if you kill the leader, then the followers will fall away.
Not necessarily, but that's not necessarily
no,
the
I mean,
case.
we see that, don't we? We've seen it in the current war. We keep killing leaders, and they keep appointing new ones, and we have to kill that one, and then. Yeah, it's not. It doesn't really work, does it?
It doesn't really work. Of course, there's always going to be a chum in life. There's always going to be that person who has this narcissistic need and desire to have this intense following. Just humanity, unfortunately. Okay, just I guess we're getting to the issue of pride and arrogance and psychological tension between ambition and social limits. So we're moving away from the individual, Adam, Chava, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Yafet, and we're moving now towards more of a social identity issue, and the Tower of Babel is that transition stage. What does it tell us about where personality in the Chumash is going? Take a guess. There's no right or wrong answer.
I don't understand the question. Sorry.
Okay, the question simply, we went from the individual. If you're taking courses in psychology, you always start with general psychology, and then you go to the individual. From the individual, you go to social psychology. That transition is apparent when we talk about Babel, the Tower of Babel. Yeah, Chumash is taking us from going beyond an individual per se and looking at that individual in terms of the social environment.
The belief system, presumably.
Which is to enhance according to the Chumash, a healthy belief system. And the challenges that we all have from the time since Babel to now. Well, those are the challenges. Those are the 70 languages that were created then.
The significance in the number of languages going backwards a little bit?
I really don't know. I never was able to figure that out. Yeah, is this significance in the number of 70 languages?
Presumably this was the first big maths job led by one person. And he went wrong. But it was possibly the first recognized big mission to create this, even though it's created wrong.
So why would that be here in the Chumash? Why would okay, so essentially the emphasis in the Midrashim are, this is the example of leadership gone wrong. And before we can get to the leadership that's done properly, we have to understand what bad leadership is about. We also have to understand that concept of pluralistic ignorance. In other words, again, let me define pluralistic ignorance for you. Pluralistic ignorance is where a majority of people of a group, could be a very large group, it doesn't have to be just a small group, it could be millions of people. The majority of the group members, they privately reject the norms of the group, but they go along with it by virtue of the fact that they incorrectly assume that most others accept it, and therefore they're going to just go along with it. Demonstrations in London. Yeah, okay, so
is that the Emperor's coat?
That's the Emperor's coat. I actually trying to find a publisher for a book that I'm writing called The Delusion of Anti-Semitism. If you really drill down on what anti-Semitism is, you'll find that there's usually one or two people who actually trigger it. And they trigger it because they have this delusional view of life. They are narcissists, or they're antisocial, or somebody hurt them early in life and that person happened to have been Jewish or something like that. And that causes them to think in this this sadistic way against Jews. And they use that narcissistic push that they have to create a following. If you stop some of these ralliers, the anti-Semitic ralliers in London or New York or wherever, and ask them what they're really talking about, they have no idea. They don't even know which river and which sea they're talking about when they chant from the river to the sea.
You're saying they have a different cause, they just follow that. This one happens to be the practical.
That is exactly correct. They are following a cause that was fed to them, generally in universities funded by Qatar, and they just are not able to think for themselves. So they just follow a cause because pluralistic ignorance sounds good. I want to be a member of this group.
There was an interview on GB News 2 days ago of a lady, American lady, who was a pro-Palestinian activist who had the guts to stop and say, "Well, hang on a minute." Went to the Nova exhibition, and then went to Israel, whichever way it went round. She actually came to Israel to see what it was all about, and did a 180, 360, whatever it is, turnaround, and is now an anti-Palestinian activist going around telling people who were pro-Palestinians. And she quite clearly said that when I was a pro-Palestinian activist, I was just fed all this stuff. And that's what everybody else did on campus. And so I followed along with it. And it seemed okay, it seemed reasonable. These are the wicked oppressors, and these are the poor oppressed. But until I actually went and found out about it for myself, and that's exactly what you're saying.
That's exactly correct.
This woman was very, very brave, actually.
And if you, that's the theme that I've always felt. I think there's a through line or a golden thread throughout all the personalities that we have in Tanach. And it follows basic human nature. If you talk about individuals, we go to groups, and we go to good groups versus bad groups. We have to learn from the bad groups first. We have to learn to be open to different experiences. We have to grow from them. So, I mean, I wrote this concise synthesis about the Tower of Babel. Psychologically, the Tower of Babel can be read as a case of highly effective collective coordination. What that means is it was a single language enforced by Nimrod. There was social identity that was enforced by Nimrod. And once they followed him, they were part of the group, even though some of them may have been pluralistically ignorant.
A cult, maybe?
In a sense, I see the cult has certain kind of requirements. So I'm not sure I would use the word cult in terms of psychological definition of the group, but in generic terms, it could apply.
Isn't it wanting to belong?
Well, they had the shared ambition. If they followed this king, they would gain some sort of benefits from it. That was their ambition. So what happens is all of this leads to a sense of overreach. And once there's an overreach, there's language fragmentation, and that breaks some of the coordination of the leader, which, by the way, we see in the MAGA movement now in America. It's very strong, and everybody was following it in conservative sides, and then started to break up because there's just too much tension at the top of that leadership. That leader can't always be right. The Midrashic literature goes along with it. It contains versions that highlight pride of leadership, divine motives that are not necessarily accurate. In other words, there's hubris, there's social influence, there's decentralization. And rather than get into some of these specific midrashim, the let us build quote that I read a few minutes ago about building this tower expresses a collective imperative that suppresses dissent. So the leader is saying, you better do what I'm telling you to do. Now, I don't know if Nimrod said it quite that way, but the implication of his leadership was, I'm the leader, you're going to follow me. And if you don't, you're out. Which may have been something that triggered.
See, I don't read it like that at all. I read it completely the opposite. Because the pasuk here in pasuk Daled says, Vayomru, and they said, Hava nivne lanu ir. Let us build a city. That sounds to me the language of persuasion, in the same way as Paro said, Hava nitchak malo. Let's get clever with these Jews and let's make them slaves. So he didn't say, the Torah doesn't say that he said, right, we're going to build this tower and you're jolly well going to follow us. it sounds to me the language of persuasion. Hava nivne lanu, let us build. In other words, come on, guys.
It's like
You know,
you're giving them free will.
come on, guys, let's get on board here. That's how I read it, which is really very different to what you're suggesting, is that there was coercion, or maybe this was coercion in a dressed up, you know, a wolf, was it? A wolf
So again,
Jobs for the boys, looking after everybody.
I'm joining the group. Let them.
so again, I mean, from that perspective, you're correct. But what was the coercive component? Again, let's use Trump because I'm very familiar with him. What did he promise when he was running for presidency? He promised that he was going to make America great again. That was a positive promise.
Now we can
But look at all leaders. What did Hitler promise
That's
Germany?
the problem. They promise what you want.
promised
They promise
influence and
right. They promise a unified in-group goal where everybody benefits.
And also each family is what they want, Britain is what they want, Jews is what they want, Scots is what they want. If this is things they want, they will take the credit. That's up to you.
Interesting. Just to kind of wrap up. Psychologically, we're going from the catastrophic reset of the flood to an attempt by a narcissistic, powerful ruler to create more control. And what we're seeing is a pattern of survival and rebuilding and pride and overreach. And what happens when you do that? Things start to fall apart. And
is that an inevitable cycle?
that's what it seems to be. It seems to be it seems to be an inevitable cycle. The problem with all of this is if you read this totally psychologically, it's just predictable. It is just totally predictable because that's what happens. Just like every 80 to 100 years, there's some sort of major anti-Semitic movement. Just like every 40 years or so, there's a change in politics from conservative to liberal. These cycles seem to go back decades, centuries.
Boom and bust.
Yeah. And people who are in leadership positions know how to manipulate them to make them work for their own, again, narcissistic needs. Now, I was thinking of, again, handing out something called the 5-factor personality theory, because as we start to discuss the avos and the imahos, I think it's important to understand who they are in terms of their basic personalities. But I think we're going to leave that for next time because time is just about running out.
Maybe you can send that. If you send it to me, I'll send it out to the group, and we can look at it before next week.
That's a good idea. We'll do.
By the way, I created a sort of Bet Midrash group. I put on those that I could think. If you're not on that group and you want to get those messages, please send me a message and I'll add you to that group. Thank you, Michael. Excellent, beautiful.
Thank you.
I'll go along with this one. Oh.
That's not right.